My name is Neil Safier. I am the director of the John Carter Brown Library here on the main green, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this final lecture in a series that the John Carter Brown Library and the Department of History have been collaborating on for the past year and a half in conjunction with other centers, departments, and institutes here at Brown. This was an initiative that was begun actually before my tenure began here at Brown a year and a half ago, masterminded by my colleague in the history department, Lynn Fisher, and the deputy director of the John Carter Brown Library, Margot Nishimura. But it was an initiative that I was very excited to continue to support, and we have had an absolutely outstanding series of lectures that I'll discuss in just a moment. We also had a wonderful exhibition that came out of this series that began at the beginning of the 1764 250th anniversary celebration. It was called Off to College: Higher Education in the Americas, and the punchline was that the time span was 1551 to 1825. That is 100 years before Harvard College was founded. There were universities and institutions of higher education in Mexico and Peru. That is really the vocation of the John Carter Brown Library to bring to the attention in comparative context. In fact, we are having an open house later this afternoon that's not listed on your schedule. So if any of you who, like me, never stepped foot in the John Carter Brown Library as undergraduates at this fine institution, I heartily welcome you to come over, even for 5 minutes. We promise not to revoke your diplomas if you do, and come and take a look at our most recent exhibit, which is actually on the subterranean worlds of the early Americas, part of a larger series as well. So as part of this year and a half long series, we heard from a wide variety of different lecturers. It began in a lecture on globalization by the Harvard historian Joyce Chaplin. It continued with a focus on the slave trade with Craig Wilder of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Moving on in collaboration with the Department of Education, with George Marsden of the University of Notre Dame. Continuing on in collaboration with the Hoffenreffer Museum of Anthropology here on campus, a lecture by Colin Calloway of Dartmouth College. In conjunction with the Department of Religious Studies, a lecture on, by Catherine Breckus of the Harvard Divinity School. Another Harvard colleague came in March, Charles Rosenberg, talking about medicine in 1764, bringing us to today in conjunction with the Watson Institute for International Studies here at Brown, a lecture by Gordon Wood. You can understand why we had thought about the possibility at the JCB of printing T-shirts that said, at the JCB, it always seems to be 1764, after this incredibly exhilarating but somewhat tiring series of lectures. In any case, my introduction of today's speaker is in fact somewhat anecdotal, and I think quite appropriate for a commencement forum, since I too am a graduate of this fine university, even though I studied comparative literature and not history. As many of you know, Brown students do not take their courses here because of any requirements or obligation. It is a hallmark, in fact, of the Brown curriculum. They take them, rather, because they hear through the grapevine about phenomenal instructors, life-changing lecturers, those professors who will be remembered not necessarily for what they taught, but really, in fact, for how they taught it, how they conveyed their passions for the topics that they discuss. As a result, when I came to Brown, there were many must-take courses. And as I think back upon my own trajectory, it was really trying to shoot a line through all of those courses and hit as many as I possibly could before I graduated. One of them, to be sure, was Ted Sizer's Going to High School in America. Another was Ed Beiser's Politics of the Legal System. Yet another, Martha Nussbaum's Philosophy and the Novel. Another extremely coveted course that I took in my senior year was Professor George Morgan's Possibilities for Social Reconstruction. And finally, Mary Gluck's course and really series in European intellectual history. I'm sure that all of you, in thinking back upon your own trajectory, remember these phenomenal professors, even if you don't necessarily remember everything that you learned in that class, or at least were supposed to learn if you weren't out doing something else more fun. One of the courses that I did not take at Brown, to my great regret, was a course that I had heard about on the Revolutionary period in American history, taught by one of the world's leading experts and quite possibly the most eminent professor of history at Brown in the 20th century. That would be Gordon Wood. To my great pleasure, and I hope your great pleasure as well, we have the privilege of hearing a lecture from him today. Gordon Wood is Alva Way Professor and Professor of History Emeritus at Brown University. He received his BA degree from Tufts University and his PhD from Harvard. He taught at Harvard as well as the University of Michigan before joining the faculty at Brown in 1969, the year of the birth of the current director of the John Carter Brown Library. He is the author of numerous incredibly prize-winning and esteemed publications, including The Creation of the American Republic, which won the Bancroft Prize and the John H. Dunning Prize in 1970. The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History, as well as the Ralph Waldo Emerson Prize in 1993. And this incredible surfeit of publications has continued, and there are perhaps even publications that I do not yet know exist because his CV is constantly changing. Gordon has also served the JCB in many capacities, most recently as the chairman of the Faculty Advisory Committee for the library, to which we are very grateful indeed. And for all of these accolades and for all of his service to the institution, I hope you will join me in giving Gordon Wood a very, very warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Neil, for that very generous introduction, and I'm delighted that you all showed up on such a beautiful day. The title of my talk is Brown University, 250 Years in a Strange Place. Now, a lot was happening in the world 250 years ago, besides the founding of this college that became Brown University. In 1764, Mozart, at the age of 8, composed his first symphony. 28-year-old John Adams married 19-year-old Abigail Smith. Their marriage lasted 54 years. James Hargreaves of Lancashire, England, invented the spinning jenny. The English radical John Wilkes, who would become an American hero, was declared an outlaw by the House of Lords for publishing a pornographic article entitled An Essay on Women. In 1764, Edward Gibbon observed a group of friars singing amidst the Roman ruins and had an epiphany that led to his writing The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Catherine the Great, in 1764, Catherine the Great of Russia, purchased a huge art collection from the German collector and began construction of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg to house that collection. The year before, in 1763, the peace treaty signed in Paris had ended the 7 Years' War between Great Britain and France, and by 1764, the British were just beginning to contemplate the immense consequences of this war, which the American colonists called the French and Indian War. The peace left Great Britain with the largest and richest empire since the fall of Rome. France was totally ousted from the North American continent. Yet within a year, everything in the English-speaking world began to come apart. And within a decade, the glorious and great British Empire was on the verge of disintegration. Thus began an era of revolutions. Before there was an Arab Spring, there was an Atlantic Spring. It was not just that the British Empire that was to come apart. The entire Western world was on the verge of becoming radically transformed. During the last quarter of the 18th century, both sides of the Atlantic world experienced a series of democratic revolutions that continued on through the first half of the 19th century, climaxing with the revolutions of 1848. And I suppose in some sense these democratic revolutions are still going on today. In 1776, the American Revolution was the first of these revolutions. Now, it was no mere colonial rebellion. It was not like the Algerians breaking away from France in the 1960s. In American eyes, and in the eyes of many radicals throughout the world, it was a world historical event. In 1785, the English dissenting minister, Richard Price, called the American Revolution the second most important event in the history of the world. The first, of course, in his eyes, was the birth of Christ. Now, the French Revolution erupted 13 years later. Now, because it was such a momentous upheaval, it has tended to dominate Western consciousness. But it followed the American Revolution, something the French have never forgiven us for. Many French leaders believed that they were directly influenced by the American example. And Lafayette sent Washington the key to the Bastille, the prison, which was the symbol of the Ancien regime. And that key hangs in Mount Vernon today. Now, with their revolution, Americans aimed not simply at ending the tyranny of Great Britain, but they aimed at abolishing tyranny everywhere and for all time. They thought their revolution would become an object lesson to oppressed peoples everywhere. They felt a responsibility to show the world how to create and sustain democracy. Americans, they told themselves, would lead the world toward a new libertarian future. Now, in an important sense, this series of momentous revolutions, this Atlantic Spring, began here in Rhode Island, and it coincided with the founding of Brown in 1764. Now, Rhode Island was by far the oddest place in North America. Of all the 13 states in 1787, it alone did not show up for the Philadelphia Convention that drafted the Constitution. The delegates at the convention thought that this absence of Rhode Island was a good thing. In the 17th century, Rhode Island had been founded by several individuals who are, I think, best described as oddballs. Roger Williams, of course, is the most famous of these. In the 1630s, he was expelled from Massachusetts Bay for his extreme religious views, and he settled in what he called Providence Plantation. He became a believer in adult baptism, which associated him with the Anabaptists, one of the most radical and feared Protestant sects in the Western world. By the 1640s, Williams' religious views had become even more extreme. He abandoned membership in all congregations and withdrew entirely from participation in organized religion. He continued, however, to pray and preach with anyone who would listen to him. Now, radical as Williams was, it turned out that he was probably the most moderate and sensible of the perfectionist founders of Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson was also a renegade from Massachusetts, driven out because of her very refined and radical Puritanism. She scorned the rules of her fellow Puritans and believed she had a direct line to God. She and her followers settled in what became Portsmouth on Aquidneck Island, which they soon named Rhode Island. In 1643, afraid of Plymouth Colony's threat to absorb Aquidneck Island, Hutchinson moved with some of her followers and her children to the Dutch territory and was now the Bronx. Unfortunately, she was killed by Indians there. William Cottington, reputedly the richest merchant in Boston, was one of Hutchinson's followers. But in 1639, he decided to move to the other end of Aquidneck Island, where he founded the town of Newport. Cottington had been one of the Puritan judges who had banished Roger Williams from Massachusetts Bay. Consequently, he and Williams did not get along at all. For a decade, Cottington struggled to keep Rhode Island separated from Aquidneck Island separated from Williams and from Providence Plantation. Cottington and the other merchants turned Newport into a major trading port. Warwick was settled by the oddest and the wildest of the founders of Rhode Island, Samuel Gorton. He was a self-educated mystic who preached a theology that no one in New England had ever heard of before. He also believed in the equality of all believers to preach, including women. He had an acute sense of justice, and in 1638 he appeared in the court in Plymouth Colony to defend his maidservant against the charge of offensive speech and carriage. She apparently smiled in church and angered the minister. Gorton spoke so passionately on her behalf and quoted so many strange interpretations of scripture in her defense that the authorities in Plymouth had him whipped and banished from that colony. Gorton moved to Portsmouth on Aquidneck Island, but there too he defied the authorities and challenged the judges when he was brought into court, calling them just asses. Once again, he was whipped and banished. In 1641, he moved to Providence, where he carried on his truculent behavior, trying the patience of even Roger Williams. Denied admissions as a voter and a landowner in the town, which called him an insolent, railing, and turbulent person, Gorton and his followers moved first to Patuxet and then to Shawmut. Now, these several towns, with their obstreperous founders, couldn't seem to get together. Newport and Portsmouth did finally ally in 1640, but almost immediately broke apart. In 1644, Williams was able to secure a patent from the Puritan Parliament in England that united Rhode Island and the Providence plantations. Massachusetts Bay authorities threatened Gorton and claimed that the town of Shawmut was part of their colony. This led Gorton to go to England to get his own patent, which he did through the influence of the Earl of Warwick. He promptly gave his town, Shawmut, the new name of Warwick. In the meantime, Cottington never accepted the union with Providence. He went himself to England and received a charter making him governor for life of Aquidneck Island. But this was short-lived, and by the mid-1650s, Cottington returned and made peace with the colony. At mid-century, the four towns, Providence, Portsmouth, Newport, and Warwick, had a population of fewer than 2,000 white inhabitants. The confederation of these towns never worked well. It fell apart in the 1650s and divided into two separate governments with two sets of officials. It was simply the personality of Williams that brought what semblance of union there was, brought them together. Colonists elsewhere considered Rhode Island a kind of sewer where all sorts of cranks and riffraff went. When the other colonies of New England, that is Plymouth, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, formed a confederation in 1643 to protect themselves from the Dutch and from the Indians, they refused to allow Rhode Island to join the group. Indeed, they tried their best to absorb pieces of the colony. The restoration of the Stuart king, Charles II, in 1660 helped to save the colony from being gobbled up. The new king, with Catholic leanings that committed him to religious toleration, gave Rhode Island a charter in 1663. Written into the charter was the colony's commitment to being a lively experiment in religious freedom. No colony came close to resembling Rhode Island in the unrestrained character of its religious life. Indeed, all aspects of Rhode Island life seemed unrestrained. Despite the existence of Rhode Island's charter, the towns remained very autonomous. So mistrustful of central authority were Rhode Islanders during the whole colonial period that they had to rotate the capital of the colony among the towns. By the 18th century, the colony had 5 capitals, one in each county: Newport, Providence, South Kingston, East Greenwich, and Bristol was added as a capital in 1746. By the time Brown was created, Rhode Island had a population of about 50,000 persons. By comparison, the population of Massachusetts Bay was about 5 times that. The extreme localization of authority, the weakness of its social hierarchy, and the high percentage of eligible voters made Rhode Island the most democratic colony in the entire British Empire. Between 75 to 80% of the adult white males could vote, a higher percentage of eligible voters than any other colony, and surely the highest in the world at that time. The colony's politics were precocious, and unlike the politics of any other colony, in no other North American colony did the people at large directly elect all the officers of the central government. Every April, the voters elected on a colony-wide basis the governor, the lieutenant governor, the secretary, the attorney general, the treasurer, together with 10 assistants who constituted the upper house of the legislature. For these colony-wide elections, Rhode Islanders developed a peculiar system of party ballots, which they call proxies. For at-large elections, these party proxies were essential, for otherwise few people would know whom to vote for. The deputies, who were the representatives in the lower house, were chosen on a local basis. And unlike any other colonial legislature, they were elected twice a year. In other words, twice a year you had elections for the House, in April and then again in August. This Rhode Island Assembly was extraordinarily powerful. The April Assembly, sitting as a committee of the whole, elected for the year the sheriffs, justices of the peace, judges, and all clerks. That is, all the colonial officers, which in the 1760s numbered about 250. In nearly all the other colonies, these officials were appointed by the governors. This is where, I guess, Rhode Island's strong assembly, which we still have, comes from. With so much popular participation, the colony's politics took on a volatility that was unmatched anywhere else. The colony was continually racked by something resembling modern party politics. In fact, it was the only colony to develop a modern two-party system. By the middle of the 18th century, politics had become crystallized into two rival factions vying for control of the government. One faction was centered in Providence. It was led by Stephen Hopkins. It competed with another faction centered in Newport and led by Samuel Ward. These political parties were more well-organized and more modern than any similar factions in the other colonies. To win elections, they used every weapon they could, including bribery, name-calling, trickery, corruption, fraud, and lots of rum. Campaign expenses were considerable. In the election of 1763, the Brown brothers contributed 1,500 pounds to the campaign, an enormous sum at the time. No other colony in North America, probably no other place in the entire world, had this degree of chaotic populist politics. Imperial officials in the other colonies shook their heads in bewilderment at what they called a downright democracy. In the 1760s, the minister of the Congregational Church in Providence labeled this system of politics Rhode Islandism. Surer methods, he said, cannot be taken to ruin a people. For these abominations, our land mourns. The colony was also the most commercially advanced of all the colonies. It was deeply involved in overseas trade, especially with the West Indies. Smuggling was rampant, in particular the smuggling of molasses from the French West Indies. Now, molasses is was a byproduct of sugar production, and it's essential to the production of rum. In 1733, Parliament, the English Parliament, had passed a Molasses Act that levied a prohibitory tariff of 6 pence a gallon on foreign molasses imported into the North American colonies. The government wanted to make sure that the British sugar planters in Barbados and Jamaica had a monopoly of rum production. The French sugar planters in the West Indies also produced molasses as a byproduct of their sugar, but the home country of France did not want rum as a rival to its brandy and wine industry. So unlike the British sugar planters, the French sugar planters had a surplus of molasses that they were only too eager to sell to Rhode Island merchants. Since these Rhode Island merchants had no intention of paying the prohibitory duty on foreign molasses, smuggling and systematic corruption became a way of life. The merchants even worked out lists of how much to pay in bribes to the various colonial customs officials. The rum industry in Rhode Island flourished. In 1764, there were as many as 30 distilleries in this tiny colony. 10% of the rum that the Rhode Islanders produced was taken to Africa in exchange for slaves who were brought to the Caribbean and to the southern colonies. Half the rum was consumed in the colony itself. Now, historians have focused on this overseas trade, partly because it's easier to document, but perhaps more important was the domestic trade that Rhode Islanders carried on with one another and with their neighbors. What was crucial for that domestic trade was paper money. Lacking specie, that is gold and silver, which people considered the only real money, the farmers of Rhode Island between 1710 and 1751 pressed the General Assembly to pass no less than 9 paper money bills, producing paper that could be used as substitutes for specie, flooding New England with paper. A minister in South County named James McSparran explained a unique technique. Rhode Islanders, he said, are perhaps the only people on earth who have hit upon the art of enriching themselves by running in debt. Now, this paper money, of course, was not good for paying bills in the French West Indies or in London, and merchants in Newport, who had overseas connections, deeply resented having to take it. They continually pressed their correspondents and creditors in Britain to put pressure on Parliament to do something to stop this paper emissions. In 1751, Parliament passed a currency act that forbade the New England colonists from making paper money legal tender in their trade. But the Rhode Islanders' use of paper money did not stop as a colony, and then later as a state in the 1780s, the commercial farmers outdid themselves with paper emissions. One of the major reasons the Constitution of 1787 was written was to stop the states, in particular states like Rhode Island, from printing paper money. Now, this was also one of the reasons Rhode Island refused to attend the Philadelphia Convention that drew up the new national constitution. Rhode Islanders knew instinctively that that convention could only be bad news for them. Since the Constitution in Article 1, Section 10, forbade the states from printing paper money, it took 2 years and enormous pressure to finally get this state to agree to join the Union. So if the constitutional prohibition against printing paper money had been rigidly enforced, the antebellum economy in the North in particular would have been frozen, stymied, cramped. The states, and especially Rhode Island, got around this prohibition by chartering banks, which in turn printed the paper money that the economy needed that enterprising people needed to trade with one another. Now, Rhode Island was notorious in its chartering of these banks. By 1818, the state already had 27 banks, nearly one in every town. Some of the banks issued more paper than was sensible. These paper would say, please pay $100, you take it to the bank, pay the holder on demand in gold and silver. But most people, as long as they trusted that the bank had specie, they passed the paper around. The Farmers Exchange Bank of Gloucester, however, admitted over $600,000 in paper, but had only $86.45 in specie to support these notes. This was too much, even for Rhode Island. And in 1809, the state legislature closed the bank, making this the first bank that went bankrupt in U.S. history. But all this paper money and participation of the state's commercially minded middling farmers and artisans in the early 19th century, I think prepared the way for Rhode Island's extraordinary commercial success in the 19th century. Inventors flourished, and more patents per capita were issued in Rhode Island than any other place in the English-speaking world. This extraordinary commercial development in turn attracted wave after wave of immigrants from Ireland, Canada, Italy, and elsewhere. By the 1890s, Rhode Island had become a major center of industries, a powerhouse, an economic powerhouse, not only in the United States, but in the world. The state dominated manufacturing in textiles, steam engines, baking powder, jewelry, silver, and small tools. 5 factories, the Corliss Steam Engine Company, Nicholson File Company, the Gorham Manufacturing Company, the American Screw Company, and Brown and Sharp Manufacturing Company. These companies were the largest of their kind in the world. No wonder Rhode Island Senator Nelson Aldrich, whom Lincoln Steffens called the general manager of the United States, became one of the most powerful political figures the United States has ever known. No more powerful senators existed until LBJ came along. In 1764, this prosperous future for the tiny colony of Rhode Island could scarcely have been predicted. That year, the outlook seemed ominous, for in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, the British government began overhauling its empire with the passage of the Sugar Act, passed in the same year Brown was founded. This act struck more directly at Rhode Island than at any other colony. The British government decided that the extent of evasion and corruption meant that the prohibitory tariff on molasses was not working. Better to lower it from 6 pence a gallon to 3 pence and then finally to 1 pence, and turn the tariff into a revenue-raising measure. At the same time, the administrative structure of the imperial bureaucracy was tightened up, and the Royal Navy and the customs officials were ordered to strictly enforce the navigation acts that regulated the trade of the colonies. Rhode Island immediately took the lead in opposition to this Sugar Act, not only by sabotaging the enforcement of the trade acts, sometimes with violence, but also by intellectual opposition. In November 1764, Governor Stephen Hopkins wrote a pamphlet, The Rights of the Colonies Examined, that denied Parliament's authority to tax the colonists. Although Hopkins was not formally educated, he was a voracious reader, something he was eager to display in his pamphlet. His pamphlet, which the General Assembly formally endorsed, was one of the initial intellectual blasts against British authority, blasts that over the following decade would end in rebellion. At the same time, a group of conservative Tories in Newport had become increasingly alarmed by the excesses of popular politics, by this democracy in the colony. In 1764, this Newport junto, called by James Otis of neighboring Massachusetts a little dirty, drinking, drabbling, contaminated knot of thieves, this junto petitioned the king to revoke the colony's charter, which they said was producing too much licentiousness. They wanted to make the colony a royal colony, with all executive officers appointed by the king. Suddenly, the charter, which had assumed a sacred character for most Rhode Islanders, was threatened, and the colony's vaunted independence was in danger of being lost. Now, these then were the fiery circumstances. This was the strange colony in which the College of Rhode Island, which later became Brown, was created. And fittingly, it was created by the most dynamic religious group in all of North America. In the middle of the 18th century, the Baptists had remained in a relatively insignificant denomination compared, say, to the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, and the Congregationalists. During the Great Awakening, which is that series of religious explosions that shook up established societies and religious groups up and down the continent in the middle decades of the 18th century, during the Great Awakening, the Baptist numbers began increasing markedly. By 1760, there were about 22,000 Baptists in New England, with 80% of them in this colony. Rhode Island, with its 17th century commitment to the separation of church and state, had always been welcoming to the Baptists, and indeed to all sorts of dissidents. The colony and the state remained a hotbed of radical sectarianism. Jemina Wilkinson, who was born in Cumberland in this state, was one of the most famous founders of the many strange evangelical sects produced by the turmoil of the Revolution. During this revolution, her sect, which was called the Universal Friends, expanded in numbers in Rhode Island, and later she and her followers moved to New York. But the followers did not survive Wilkinson's death in 1819. One of the reasons they did not survive was that they believed in total sexual abstinence. Now, the Baptists were the religious group who benefited most from the disorder and the confusion of the Revolution. During the Revolution, the number of Baptists grew rapidly, not only in Rhode Island and New England, but everywhere up and down the continent. In 1760, the Baptists had only 94 congregations in all of the colonies. By 1790, 30 years later, they had 858 churches and had become the single largest religious denomination in all of North America. The founding of Brown was crucially important to that extraordinary growth. It gave the denomination prestige and self-confidence that had hitherto it had lacked. A few Baptists had graduated from Harvard or Yale, but the last to do so had graduated in 1734. For the next 30 years, only one Baptist is known to have received a college education in New England. Because the standing order of Congregationalists had so often ridiculed the Baptists for their lack of learning, the Baptists, in self-defense, had tended to downplay education and in contrast to piety. By 1764, the Baptists in all the colonies were eager to acquire more respectability in line with their increasing numbers. They realized that they were the only major religious group that did not have a college. The Congregationalists had Harvard and Yale. The Anglicans had 3 colleges, William and Mary in Virginia, a college that became UPenn in Pennsylvania, and of course King's College in New York, which later became Columbia. The Presbyterians had the College of New Jersey in Princeton. In the 1750s, the Philadelphia Association of Baptists created a Latin grammar school, Hopewell Academy, for the training of young Baptists who would presumably go on to college. One of its first graduates was James Manning, who went on to the college at Princeton, College of New Jersey at Princeton. The success of the grammar school, Hopewell Academy, prepared the way for the more ambitious hope or step of establishing a Baptist college. The Middle Colony Baptists decided on Rhode Island for their college. With Roger Williams as its principal founder, and with 80% of the New England Baptists inhabiting the colony, Rhode Island was the natural location. Actually, some of the Congregationalists in Newport, led by the Reverend Ezra Stiles, Congregational minister, had already been thinking of a college for the colony, but of course Stiles was not thinking of a Baptist college. This was to prove tricky. In 1763, the Reverend James Manning, later joined by Morgan Edwards, another Baptist minister from Pennsylvania, came up to Rhode Island and drew up plans for a colonial charter for the college. Neither man knew much about the faction-ridden politics of the colony and the competition between Newport and Providence. The college was to be a Baptist-governed, but as Manning explained, it would take in as many of the other denominations as was consistent with a Baptist-dominated college. Naively, he and Edwards asked the Baptists in Newport to draft a charter that could be presented to the legislature. But the Newport Baptists felt unequal to the task, and so they asked the Congregational minister, Ezra Stiles, to help them out by drafting the charter. Now, as a graduate of Yale, Stiles, they said, was a man of learning and a man of the world. He was also very shrewd. Stiles had been told that although some other denominations might be allowed some minority participation as trustees of the college, the Baptists were to be in full control of the corporation. Manning had to be away, unfortunately, and he didn't check out Stiles's charter. Apparently, Stiles assumed that the college would be the colony's college, not a Baptist college at all, but an ecumenical one. Stiles drew up a plan for 2 branches of the corporation of the college. Now, this was not an emulation of Harvard, which, unlike the other colonial colleges, also had a bicameral trusteeship. Rather, it was an effort by Stiles to get as many non-Baptists into the corporation as possible. The trustees, numbering 35, were supposed to be the principal branch of the corporation, at least in the eyes of the Newport Baptists. And Stiles gave the Baptists 19 seats as trustees. The remaining trustees were distributed as follows: 7 to the Congregationalists, 5 to the Quakers, and 4 to the Anglicans. But Stiles granted actual authority over the college to the other, smaller branch of the corporation, the Fellows. He arranged that 8 out of the 12 Fellows were to be Congregationalists, with no religious stipulation for the remaining 4 seats. Now, in August 1763, the Newport Baptists, seeing that they had a majority of the trustees, 19 out of 35, innocently sent the charter to the Rhode Island Assembly for acceptance, which most expected to be automatic. However, Daniel Jenks of Providence, one of the Hopkins faction, despite being one of the less sophisticated Providence Baptists, figured out the artful way that Stiles had drafted the charter, and he urged the legislature to postpone action. The assembly immediately fell apart in factional fighting, with the Congregationalists and the Episcopalians, urging swift passage of the act chartering the college. But the Baptists in the assembly, now alerted by Jenks, were sufficiently numerous to get a postponement. Stiles, who later went on to become president of Yale, defended his shenanigans by saying that he had given the Baptists timely warning to take care of yourselves, just as we Congregationalists had looked after ourselves. I'm not a rogue, he said, but the Baptists didn't agree. The Rhode Island Baptists were furious for being misled by Stiles. They asked the Philadelphia Association for advice, and it sent the Reverend Samuel Jones and a lawyer to Rhode Island to help the Baptists here draft a new charter. This new document kept the bicameral corporation, but put the Baptists in complete control. It required the president of the college to be a Baptist. It provided for 8 out of the 12 fellows, including the president, to be Baptists, and added 3 more Baptists to the trustees, which now numbered 36. So the Baptists had 22 trustees, while the remaining trustees would be made up of 5 Quakers, 5 Anglican Episcopalians, and only 4 Congregationalists. The college corporation had become somewhat diverse, but not in the way Stiles had wanted. The college charter was extraordinarily liberal, as many of you know, for its time. It allowed for representation of various religious groups on its governing boards, and it clearly stated, except for the president, no religious test should ever be required of the faculty or the students. Furthermore, it stated that sectarian differences of opinion shall not be made any part of the public and classical instruction. Not only was Brown the first Baptist college in the British colonies, it was the first Baptist college in the entire English-speaking world. Now, parenthetically, you might point out between 1926 and 1945, the college cut its ties, as many of the other Ivy League schools did with their religious affiliation, cut its ties with the Baptists. And as historian Stan Lemons has pointed out, today both Muslims and Jews probably outnumber the Baptists in the student body. Now, everyone in 1764 and 65 was unhappy about the controversy over the charter. The Baptists and the Congregationalists each accused the other of bad faith. Consequently, Stiles and the Congregationalists refused to associate themselves with the college. Stiles was angry that his liberal charter had been thwarted. He said, however, that with a good deal of condescension, that he wished the college well. It was, after all, as he said, the only means of introducing learning among our Protestant brethren, the Baptists. Since the Congregationalists dominated the colonies of Massachusetts and Connecticut and sided with Stiles, established people throughout New England dismissed the entire episode as typical of the crazy popular politics of Rhode Island and of the narrow-minded parochialism of the Baptists in the colonies. Now, Stephen Hopkins became the first chancellor, and James Manning became the first president of the college. Since Manning lived in Warren and was pastor of the Baptist church there, the college was at first located there. In 1765, there was only 1 student. Then in 1766, 5 more students were added. In 1767, 4 more. In 1768, 8 more. And in 1769, 11 students enrolled, most of them coming from outside, from other colonies than Rhode Island. In 1769, the college graduated its first class of 7 young men. The forensic debate held at commencement was over the issue whether the Americans, in their present circumstances, should continue to work to become independent from Great Britain. The 2 students who took opposing positions spoke, as it was said, with much emphasis and propriety. The student who favored independence argued that the British wished to make us slaves, and thus independence was necessary. Even the student who was supposed to defend remaining in the British Empire claimed that the attacks of the parent state upon American freedom had aroused the people in defense of their rights. We might note that Thomas Paine's common sense and the Declaration of Independence was still 7 years away. On this commencement day in 1769, the corporation tried to settle upon a permanent home for the college and suggested Warren. This suggestion aroused people in other towns, and a struggle began over where the college was to be located. East Greenwich made a case for itself, but the contest really came down to one between Newport and Providence. Newport was far bigger and richer and had the advantages of the Redwood Library. Providence, led by Stephen Hopkins and the Brown brothers, emphasized its central location and the willingness of its leaders to subscribe to the college. Although Providence in 1769 was less wealthy and had only half the population of Newport, the future belonged to it, and many Rhode Islanders sensed that. Newport was an important entrepot, but because it was on an island, it had no hinterland to easily trade with, but Providence did, reaching all the way into Worcester, for example. And many Rhode Islanders were coming to realize that domestic trade was becoming more important for their colony than overseas trade. The Providence advocates told the inhabitants of the neighboring towns of Scituate and Gloucester that the college would bring money into Providence, thereby greatly increasing the markets for all kinds of your produce, and consequently it would increase the value of all estates to which this town is a market. Although historians often claim that Newport was done in by the destruction caused by the Revolution, the British occupation, actually its future was determined more by the changing patterns of trade. President Manning, through his support to Providence, there were, after all, more Baptists in Providence than in Newport. Manning told the Brown brothers that Providence could build the college more cheaply than Newport, and in 1770, the Browns made a proposal that the corporation accepted. The Newporters were furious and threatened to get the legislature to charter another college, but that never came to anything. In Providence, John and Moses Brown had already anticipated the precise location for this college and had purchased land on the hill at the head of what became College Street. This was the spot that Morgan Edwards in 1771 said was made for a seat of the Muses. The College Edifice, now University Hall, was built by the firm of Nicholas Brown and Company. Because the early American Baptists were generally not wealthy people, the college never received the kind of generous financial support that enabled Harvard, Yale, and Princeton to create large endowments. It also never received any direct aid from the state of Rhode Island. From the outset, the corporation was reduced to promising naming rights to anyone who could give it an ample endowment. In the Brown family, the college did find one wealthy set of donors that could be counted on to help the college survive its early financial crises. Now, the Browns were an extraordinary family, one of the great families of the history of the United States. While the Brown brothers were helping to establish the college, they were at the same time involved in the building of the Baptist Meeting House, erecting the market house at the foot of the hill, and founding the library that eventually became the Providence Athenaeum. Although we know the college decided in 1804 to adopt the name Brown because of the gift of Nicholas Brown, Jr., class of 1786, in retrospect, it seems that the college was destined to be named Brown. Now, we've heard in recent years of the involvement of the college and the Brown family in slavery, but we need to put that involvement in historical context. In 1776, slavery existed in all of the colonies. It was not just the Southern revolutionary leaders, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and so on, who owned slaves. So did many of the Northern leaders. Boston's John Hancock, New York's Robert Livingston, Philadelphia's John Dickinson, all were slaveholders. On the eve of the Revolution, the mayor of Philadelphia possessed 31 slaves. Now, it's important to keep in mind that Rhode Island, and in particular, some members of the Brown family, took the lead in abolishing slavery, not just in the state, but in the nation. The man who gave the $5,000 endowment that allowed him to name the institution was Nicholas Brown, Jr. He was not one of the famous Brown brothers. He was a leading abolitionist and a prominent member of his uncle, Moses Brown's Abolition Society. Nicholas was only the nephew of John Brown, the notorious slave trader. Individuals should not be held responsible for the behavior of their uncles. This university has nothing to be ashamed of by bearing the name Brown. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, we have about 7 minutes before people have to run off, but we have microphones here, and Professor Wood has graciously agreed to answer any questions questions you may have about Rhode Island or any other part of the colonies.
Brown has removed the motto "In Deus Speramos" from our shield. And I wonder if you know who put it there in the first place, and what was the thinking behind it, and why did we purge it from our institutional identity?
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe someone else does. I didn't know that it had been removed, but maybe somebody else knows. Here's a question. Yeah.
I was just going to say I don't know the answer, but there is an exhibit at the Hoffenreffer Museum right now that is called "In Deus Speramos," and I would be surprised if it didn't have the answer to that question.
This young lady here. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks. That was fabulous. My question has to do with your last statements about Nicholas Brown Jr.
Right.
and the naming rights for Brown and John Brown being his uncle. So I was wondering about the DeWolf family and Brown University, if you could speak a little bit about that. The DeWolf family of Bristol.
The DeWolf family were notorious slave traders, deeply involved in the slave trade, and there was a good deal of violation of the slave trade even after the 1808 laws prohibiting international slave trade. So a good deal of corruption and evasion that had its roots in the colonial period continued even with the slave trade. But Nicholas Brown Jr., the man who gave the name to the institution, was an abolitionist and a leading abolitionist. So the family is divided on this issue, obviously. And Moses Brown, as you know, became one of the nation's foremost reformers, not just in his anti-slavery, but in a whole host of other kinds of 19th century reforms. So the Brown family is divided on these issues, but the man who actually gave the name to the institution with his $5,000 contribution was an abolitionist.
I graduated in 1965, so you had not yet arrived on campus, and the director of the JCB very magnanimously in introducing you indicated what I'm sure is quite true, that you were, of the 20th century, the greatest or most renowned professor of history at Brown. In my day, the gentleman in the history department who had that distinction was James Blaine Hedges.
Right.
And I wonder if you might speak a moment about him as a historian. I know that he wrote, at the time, a very important work,
right.
The Browns of Providence Plantations.
I never knew, I didn't know Jim Hedges, as he was called, but he has written so far, the best history of the Brown family. He was an economic historian, so his focus is on the commercial development. It's a 2-volume history. The second volume he didn't quite finish himself. He died prematurely, and I think it was completed by Ed Morgan, who was one of my predecessors here at Brown, who then went on to Yale. So that is the current work. It isn't extraordinary that there aren't more histories. Those papers now deposited in the JCB are an enormous source for historians of all sorts, because they're the family papers that go on right up into the 19th century of this extraordinary family.
Any other questions? I might ask, if no one else has a question, just picking up on that, what was it like to arrive at the history department in 1969?
Well, the new curriculum had just been introduced, and there were, I don't know if you remember this, the course performance reports, which Ira Magazine thought would be a substitute for grades. I had, I think, 85 people in my class, and I had a grader, but no TAs to really. And so we got these course performance reports submitted by 85 students, and what could we say? We didn't know them. We would say, Jane Smith got a B+. And they soon fell away because nobody, and now every once in a while you'll have a student who resurrects the idea of it and fills one out, but within a couple of years, people stopped using them. The graduate schools that the kids wanted to go on to didn't want to read 32 or 36 course performance reports, so they preferred to see the grades, and grades came in. The one deficiency that I felt, and has continued, is that there are no pluses and minuses in the grading. It was very crude, A, B, and C, and it really hurt the B students. The B+ students were desperate to get an A minus, and they were lumped in with the B- students who were hovering on the edge of a C, which was considered practically a failure, since there were very few people who actually failed. So I think the grading system, which is still in existence, is too crude. It should be more reflective of, especially the B students are hurt badly, which has led to grade inflation. You feel bad for the B+ student who's almost an A-, and yet that B is going to look just like the B-. And so it was kind of a, at any rate, the system didn't quite work as Magaziner intended, and the course performance report. But I think the open curriculum worked out fairly well. People with their cafeteria-style choices tended to be pretty selective. And a study that was done in the 90s by the dean of the college showed that with the exception of the engineers and the fine arts people, everyone was selecting science or social science and humanities. They were distributing themselves fairly broadly across the curriculum. And all the language departments except German were oversubscribed. So I think it worked out better than many of the conservative opponents imagined.
Well, as a very, very high B+ student, I'd have to agree with all of these comments that he's made.